Hello, folks. Welcome back to Understanding Christian Marriage. We are coming together through this semester, through these 8 weeks, to look at the biblical perspective of marriage, particularly from a Christian standpoint. Obviously, that is in the title of the course, but a reminder that there are many people who share views of marriage, and there are many that have varying views or different views, and that can be based on faith, that can be based on family background, that could be based on experience, both positive and negative. What we find in the biblical text is an explanation of scripture or an explanation of marriage as a gift from God. As a reminder, you find in the book of Genesis this idea that man and woman, for that matter, are not good alone. Let me restate that this does not mean that everyone gets married, and some people's closest connections are to their best friends or to parents, but they never get married. However, the majority of individuals in the world, as they come to adulthood, decide that they want to join together, man with woman, woman with man. And the Christian model of that is through the God sanctioned commitment of marriage. And it is in with that context and only within that context, biblically speaking, that there can be the sexual intimacy, that there can be that ultimate intimacy between a man and a woman. We're going to continue to look at this topic of Christian marriage today as we refer back to the Balswick book. But again, I want to remind you of Ephesians chapter 5 first, because in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 and following is perhaps the most well known passage of scripture dealing with marriage. But we must know that it follows verse 21, that for marriage to exist as it should, biblically speaking, that Ephesians 5:21 must be kept in place, and that is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. As we talked a little bit about this last week, there are varying views even within Christianity and what that looks like to unpack the rest of that passage. For example, verse 22 talks about wives submitting to their husbands. How much of that is cultural to the first century is debated by Christian believers. How much of that has to deal with only certain aspects of a marriage also is debated by Christians. But we must understand that all of it is fitting, regardless of the view, whether it is more traditionally and patriarchal or it is more egalitarian, that it's all based in the idea of Ephesians chapter 5, mainly flowing out of verse 21, that command all believers to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And you see that reference to Christ throughout the remainder of those verses dealing with marriage. We also see Paul talking about marriage. You can find these in his writings to the Corinthian Christians. I want you to make sure you read those sections as well. And in those sections, you are finding the instruction to the early church believers who are in a state of confusion or at least questioning. They are understanding that some of them are coming to Christ. This, again, is a first century Christian aspect. There are people who are coming to Christ and their spouses have not yet or will not accept Christ. And one of their questions for Paul is, since I am a Christian and my spouse is not, should I stay in this marriage or should I not? And Paul is very clear in his writing saying to the Christian believer that you should stay with this person that you've chosen to marry. And in fact, this might lead that person to accept Christ for themselves. He says that in your behavior and in your love towards them, you might even bring that person to the awareness of Christ and to the step where they will accept Christ. Paul is very clear that no one is to divorce the other spouse lest the other spouse decides to leave. And that is an important concept for us to understand as well. The Bible is clear about the yoking together of individuals, and that is to be of like mind. And particularly, we're talking here about the Christian faith. And the question is often asked when we talk about understanding Christian marriage, what does that look like? We do see marriages work between a Christian and a person of another faith or no faith. But the best model is that of a husband who is a Christian and a wife who is Christian, working together, focusing on Christ, and then using that relationship that they have with Him and the relationship they have with each other to glorify Christ in their marriage. And that is why it's so important when we tell young people as they set off in meeting their future spouse that they narrow that search, shall we say, to those of like faith, to those who are believing. We're going to be looking primarily at chapters 4 and 5 during this lecture of the Baldwick book. And before we go on to chapter 4, I want to remind you of a chart that's found on page 39 of the book. And this is a helpful guide for us because it talks about varying degrees of 4 elements that we have a marriage that begins with the initial covenant. This is, think of it as the marriage day, the pledge to be married, this pledge that they are, as husband and wife, going to honor God to the best of their ability in their marriage. And what we find is, according to this book, that as you grow toward the mature covenant, how we stick together even in the midst of our flaws and our imperfections, that what improves that is the intensifying of the degrees of 4 areas of focus: the degree of commitment, the degree of grace, the degree of empowering, the degree of intimacy. So let's talk about that a little bit. The degree of commitment. Our commitment increases as we move from initial covenant to mature covenant, at least it should. Now, how this works is it is more easy to love during the what we often call the honeymoon period. We are awestruck, we are passionate, we are excited, and this hopefully continues throughout the marriage to varying degrees. But we understand that the commitment must be firm because as life happens, as children come along, as people face medical situations, as people face financial situations, as people face the loss of a job or loss of parents, or as other parts of life begin to press in on the marriage, the commitment will grow. And commitment is tested, as we see most likely, through the difficult times or less than easy times within marriage. We also see this other idea of the degree of grace. God is the author of grace, and grace and forgiveness are intertwined. This is, the understanding that grace needs to increase within marriage. This is overlooking flaws. This is letting go of things that you want to hold against your spouse. We grow in that. The degree of empowering. One of the things that we see, regardless of our view of marriage, whether it is more the father as the head and the husband as the head of the household, or more egalitarian in the way we work with our strengths and our weaknesses, the husband and the wife are to empower each other. We look at our strengths and we say, go and use that strength. We look at our weaknesses and we say to our spouse, let me help you in that area, not in a prideful way, but in a helpful way. And that needs to continue on. Now, you can really help see this as you move into times of parenting, let's say, because as children come along, there's more responsibility. And if one parent decides that the other parent is going to be taking care of diapers and bedtime and all the things that come along with kids, and that's going to cause conflict, and to empower that other person is to help them. We see this also later in life as senior adults need more care. Sometimes that's extreme. A person is in need of much care, and sometimes the spouse can handle that, and sometimes the spouse cannot handle that. But the idea is to be empowered to empower the other person to live their best life. And then this idea of degree of intimacy. This can be emotional intimacy, this can be spiritual intimacy, and this definitely is physical intimacy that this must develop. One of the ways this is seen in marriage is through the understanding of intimacy growing past the honeymoon stage. Not past in the sense of it's getting better necessarily, but in the fact that in the honeymoon period, there's passion, there's excitement, there's newness to this shared experience between husband and wife. And this growing intimacy, and we're talking about the physical intimacy, is the understanding that they learn to not go after their own desires, but the desires of their spouse. It's very biblically grounded in the idea of don't look after your own interest, but the interest of others. And also, this idea of the patience of working with the spouse as they go through different physical changes throughout life. This kind of intimacy must increase so that expectations are legitimate, expectations are real, expectations that are healthy are met, and there's an agreement on the intimacy that must remain a part of marriage. And this is essential. So, as all these things come together, a person moves from the intimate covenant to the mature covenant. So, let us now go to 4, chapter 4. Now, we're talking about the Gracie marriage, which is why I wanted to go back to that chart, because as we saw, grace is such an aspect, a true needed aspect of marriage. When we look at chapter 4 and we talk about Gracie marriage, I want to understand, help you understand two key words that you're going to see reference in this course, but also reference within the Christian faith on a broader spectrum. Grace and mercy. Grace and mercy. Grace is this being given what we don't deserve. It is the gift of grace. To grace somebody, to use that as a verb, to grace somebody is to give to somebody or to bless somebody with something that they don't deserve. We're just doing it out of love for that person. Mercy, you could think of as a form of grace in reverse. And what we mean by this is mercy is choosing to extend love through withholding punishment. The choosing of extending love through withholding punishment. That's what mercy is. Think of even in a wrestling match, you have the mercy rule, tap out, we might call it. This is the I give up moment. And the person that extends mercy is the one that says, I have the power to cause harm, or I have the power to lay down authority. But mercy says, I don't want to cause harm. I don't want to play the trump card just so I can say I win. It is, I am here. I recognize the wrong that you have done, and perhaps even the wrong you've done to me, but I am going to extend mercy. And this is what we see in this text. So you can think of grace as giving, and mercy as withholding in the positive way. I'm giving grace, I'm withholding punishment, and that becomes mercy. Marriage should be, as your book talks about, the atmosphere for that first one, atmosphere for grace. On the top of page 49 in the book, it says, living in an atmosphere of grace erases guilt and shame, wipes the slate clean, gets beyond the mistakes, gives impetus to change, and moves spouses forward in renewed commitment. This amazing aspect of this erasing guilt and shame and wiping things clean and getting beyond things. This is something that must take place within marriages in order for them to be healthy and in order for them to be in the sense that we're using them Christian marriage. Because again, Christian marriage is not simply a marriage between two Christians. That's a start. But those two Christians must commit to being Christ-like within the marriage for a Christian to truly live within what we're calling Christian marriage. This is helpful for us to understand, and it's pivotal if we're going to understand how to actually live this out in a way that is helpful and is worthy. We're going to take a quick break and click on the next video here in a minute for this time together.